Guimeng, White Lotus. White blooms are often outweighed by flowers of more seductive hues. These flowers should be planted in a jade pool. Heartless they may seem, but who can know their deep grief? They will fall when moonlight fades and the morning wind blows. Okay, so here we have a poem by Lu Guimen. So let's start explaining a little bit of who he was. So Lu Guimen is basically a native of the Wu area of China, which is the southeastern coast, the heartland of one of the ancient kingdoms of China. And he spent most of his life there. He lived in basically the second half of the 9th century, so this would be the late Tang, the period in which the dynasty is starting to unravel, and in which massive peasant rebellions are cooking up and about to bring the dynasty to its knees. As for Lu Guimen, well, he wasn't very successful in life, as far as we know. Like he studied under a prefect in Muzhou, and afterwards he basically studied Taoism and in a Lao Tzu academy. So he's basically considered a Taoist. He failed the Jinshi examinations, and after that, he basically spent, as I said, the rest of his lifetime very close to the Mao Shan mountain complex. The Mao Shan area is a very important place for Taoism. It's a little bit like other important Buddhist mountains, like Tiantai, I think, Tianmu, for Buddhists. And, this was a vast, sprawling Taoist complex. And in the late years of the Tang, in the vicinity of Mao Shan, a group of poets and artists got together and, they just ignored civic obligations and the typical conventional pressures to join the officialhood. And, they just wrote poems and cultivated the arts. This would become much more common in successive Chinese dynasties, by the way. So Lu Guimen was part of a coterie that included especially his friend and also poet Piri Xu and the scholarly Taoist Zhang Ben. And these usually appear in the titles of Lu Guimen's poems. So, the stereotypical portrait of Lu Guimen has him as, a Taoist person disconnected from the world, amassing a big library and, roaming around, enjoying tea, moving around through the watery areas of the south of China by boat, carrying his own bedding, desk, bundles of books, angling gear, and a tea stove. Now, he really fits into this stereotypical portrait of the sophisticated person who has stripped himself of worldly pleasures and worldly ambitions. Now, his poems are about a great variety of topics. A lot of them include nature, trees, flowers, birds, insects, and clouds. And this poem that we've read is an example of this. This is a heptasyllabic quatrain, so a very brief poem by Lian in Chinese, White Lotus. And as you see, it's a very brief poem, and there's two ways in which you can read this poem, which usually happens with nature poems in Chinese. And that is, you can interpret it literally as just a descriptive poem of a lovely sight in nature, but you can also perhaps interpret it allegorically. So on the one hand, it's a description of a flower in a pond and a white lotus, but on the other hand, it could be read also as a personal plaint, with Lu Guimen implicitly comparing himself to the white lotus, being, pure, detached from the world, outstanding, but not able to attain the recognition that men of more seductive hues get. So, the poem has two couplets. The first one focuses on it describes the white lotus flowers and gives some information about them. The second couplet does not really break with the first. I mean, this poem reads pretty continuously, but it imbibes the lotus flowers, which were described in the first couplet, with emotional background, with emotional context, and with the sadness of their eventual decline and fall. So, first couplet: white blooms are often outweighed by flowers of more seductive hues. These flowers should be planted in a jade pool. So the Tang era witnessed an explosion of interest in flowers, but the main flower that the equivalent of the tulips for 17th century Dutch people were, during the Tang dynasty, peonies, mutan. And there was a Chinese craze for these flowers. There were gardens in the capital that had them. There were intense disputes in who had the most beautiful peonies, and people even went to the gardens to steal those flowers and take them to some other gardens. It was an aristocratic pleasure to go viewing peonies and also getting them to breed and then produce different colored, different hued varieties. Red colors, intense colors, of course, they can evoke sadness. For example, red, the color of blood. So it's very easy to attribute to some intensely red flowers. Well, they're feeling, they're shedding tears of blood, as it would seem. And as opposed to these, the lotus flowers, especially these white lotuses are pretty plain. It's just a nice white flower. If you like the color white, it's okay, but plain, simple color. So these white blooms, these beautiful lotus flowers, they grow in the mud, they climb up to the top of the pond and show their whiteness, but they are maybe at a competitive disadvantage to more showy conventional flowers. And they grow in the water. But the second couplet tells us, okay, these flowers, which grow in the mud, which are so plain looking, are actually really special. He says, heartless they may seem, but who can know their deep grief? Behind that plain, simple whiteness lies deep emotion, deep feeling, and a feeling of grief, of sadness. Sadness at what? Maybe at inevitable death and the passage of time, which is the conventional topic of Chinese scholarly official poetry. Probably, the last line of the poem hints in that direction. They will fall when moonlight fades and the morning wind blows. So the morning wind, moonlight fading, traditional icons, traditional symbols of the passage of time and the fugacity of human life. But then again, as we said, you could read this deep grief as a complaint at lack of recognition. And I think this is all we have to say about this poem. As I said, it's a pretty plain and straightforward piece. Nature poems are abundant, it seems, in Guimeng's production, but probably he also has lots of poems about Mount Maoshan, about manuscripts. He has Fu on themes like moss, lice, mythical animals, also some prose writings that have been admired.